what's next for the way we procure and build. I'd like to invite now our three other panellists to come up on stage as I introduce you. Dean Willemsen is Managing Director of the D&W Group. A true entrepreneur, Dean co-founded Prime Build, part of the D&W Group, in 2008, when just 23. He still looks like he's 23. In 2014, Prime Build was ranked 4th in BRW's Fast 100 list of the fastest growing companies in Australia. Specialising in retail refurbishment and fit-outs, Prime Build's national client relationships include Aldi, Kmart and Myer. Another business arm is ClearState, a greenfield land developer with a $200 million pipeline. This gives Dean a builder and developer perspective and those insights as well. Caitlin Shields is an associate and 5D quantity surveyor at Mitchell Brandtman. Caitlin specialises in building information modelling and estimating from models. With over 11 years at the firm, Caitlin has provided guest lectures on the subjects of cost planning, BIM, 5D quantity surveying at various national universities. Our last panellist is Chris Stevenson. Chris is National Construction Manager for Hutchinson. Hutchies is Australia's largest privately owned construction company. Chris is experienced in all aspects of project delivery, from funding, design and construction, implementation of value engineered design, resource management, risk management, and user operational needs management, including stakeholder management. He constantly evaluating proposals to the works, including identifying potential solutions to provide the optimal outcome for the client. Together, as you can see, we have a very nice mix of perspectives on the panel. I'll now ask each of the panellists to make some comments about the topic, and then we'll have some discussion. Chris, may I ask you first to make some opening remarks about this topic, tectonic shifts in constructions, what's going to change with the way we procure and build, from your perspective?
Yeah, look, having watched some of the presentations earlier today, you can really see the fabric of change through everything in society, from autonomous vehicles to the way we engage with socially at work and that sort of thing. That's all going to feed back into significant change in buildings. We're just not going to see one alternative material or whatever. We're going to see an entire change to the way the buildings are put together, both procured, but also what we're trying to deliver. It's not just about creating a building, it's about creating spaces for people. We're really moving into a space of exploring the mental health of people, engaging with every type of person there is to bring them back into those spaces.
Caitlin?
Sure. So I work with Matt Hemming, who was on earlier. So naturally, my angle for this and the tectonic shifts is about BIM and 3D models. And I do believe that's going to be a big player in the way we see changes in procurement and construction. So in terms of procurement and the before construction side of things, there's big changes we're already seeing with 3D models and how that's representing what our buildings look like before we even get to site. When you take it to construction and you have models that are visually representative of the buildings, things that we're able to do now and moving forward and pushing that into the future is things like simulating the constructability, laying out the site before you're even out on site and making sure things move and work together on site. So I think at the core of it, 3D and BIM is a big change in how we're going to move forward.
Dean?
Thanks, Warren. To be...
You're the trick one.
Thanks, Warren. To be 23 again. But I'm going to a bit of a fan of the future of how we procure and how we build, because my business is actually a product of, I suppose, a tectonic shift in construction. We're fortunate enough to be, engaged by customers who are prepared to do things a bit differently and to give, contractors, a chance to see a longer, pipeline of work and able to be set up for success and ultimately deliver better outcomes, I suppose, fresh ideas, being innovative and not being stuck in the old ways of operating.
George, do you have any comments about some of the things the other panellists have raised?
I mean, I was going to actually raise something a bit different, but I think climate change is going to be a big driver of, of the industry. I think it's going to drive a whole lot of innovation around materials. But I think it's hard to go past BIM and the way digital is going to open up new opportunities for. I think it'll open up opportunities for prefab and something that's close to your heart. And I think also we're going to see some amazing applications when people start getting familiar and comfortable with the BIM environment.
Mm-hmm.
George just touched on a couple of things that I know are close to Chris's heart. Prefab is for me also. But I know, Chris, you're very aware of demand to have ever-increasing performance in buildings. A lot of it around energy, which has become quite familiar with already, but increasingly about comfortable, healthy environments. But interestingly, that demand for higher performance is not necessarily matched with an appetite to pay for those extra things. So there's an economic struggle or battle underway there. You've got some thoughts on that, I'm sure.
I think there has been an economical struggle. I think that it's changing though. I think people are seeing the value that you need to put into people, into occupants of buildings, whether people just move businesses, they move buildings, they'll just evacuate from one building to another to gain the benefits of what a new building can offer. I think that what we're seeing is people really starting to evaluate how much value those people are and then put it back into the business. We're seeing a lot more wellness ratings come in. It's not just about energy or water. That's how we've built for the past 2,000 years is try and save power and save water. And that's not going to die off by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that we're doing it relatively well, and we're only going to get better and better because we've got quite a lot of data. The data that we've collected on people though, and interior environments, and how we can actually create buildings that people want to be in and can use in the changing. There's a lot of change. You're talking about your AI and that sort of thing. There's going to be a lot of change in the type of jobs. There's going to be people lose jobs, other jobs start to happen. What if we take high-risk activities and turn them into a robot that a person can pilot from a remote location? They could be working from home, literally. Now that's a fairly decent sort of horizon, but you start looking at singularity supposed to happen by 2045. It's not too far away in reality, where it just runs away and we can't actually speculate what's going to happen 25 years down the track. But if we look at 10 years ago, we only just got smartphones. In 10 years' time, if anyone watches Netflix, Black Mirror, that sort of thing, you get the eyepieces and whatnot. What's to stop us from having that sort of technology to assist, along with algorithms, that's the thing that we can actually just physically look at work and make an assessment of whether it's compliant at that point and record it. It gives us our records, gives us our quality assurance, all there. Everything's happening. It could all particularly be happening at once in reality. So we're going to get some efficiencies out of that sort of thing. Material science, for sure, that I think 5% of emissions worldwide is out of concrete alone. They've now developed, or they're developing CO2 concrete, which is you actually take carbon dioxide and lime and 3D print it, and they're actually turning it into carbon positive as opposed to carbon negative. You'll be returning emissions from 5% alone back to negative 5% on that basis alone. So there's all of these sort of things that are coming into it, which are going to provide that economy to put back into that internal space. And you're talking about the internal spaces. The world was built by people with Asperger's for anyone who really wants to get at the mental health thing. Those people have difficulty fitting into the normal spaces that we've been trying to compress them into. We've been looking at energy efficiency, we've been looking at smart glass and that sort of thing, but we've got crappy interiors that people really just can't fit into, and the noise and the lack of sensory spaces and whatnot. I think that we're going to be starting to see a big shift as we move into the future, where we're trying to create that space. And that's going to change the economy of how we actually build the buildings, without a doubt. Prefab's going to come into it, without a doubt. Continuing to keep the structures lightweight. We've gone from, with the argument about lightweight cladding, your ACP, how it catches some fire and whatnot. Precast is very heavy. It adds foundations, it adds structure. It's expensive. ACP has been developed for a reason. So we'll continue to see those sort of materials developed, and we'll continue to see buildings built as linear as possible. 20 years ago, we were building 40-storey buildings. Now we're building 120-storey. We're going to continue to see, heights challenged in areas that there can be. We have flight paths, and that will change. But even though flight paths may change, as technologies develop, that we can actually change the actual angle of planes coming across cities and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of stuff happening outside of construction that's going to influence what we do. But the real influence is going to be that those people are going to want to have a certain space, and we're going to make that economy work.
Does any of the other panellists want to pick up on anything Chris said? Or I throw you another question?
I was going to say, just to extend from that and what George showed up on the screen before, the way that we're making things automated and able to produce structures that weren't able to be done in the past, like the steel members on that bridge, is really changing how we can construct things, because people couldn't imagine it. They could draw it freehand, but how would we ever engineer it to be able to construct it? And I think that's going to change as well, in addition to what you're talking about, to really change our buildings right from the very foundations. I don't think that's too far of a stretch.
Dean, you and I both heard a couple of weeks ago Mark Farmer, who did the Farmer Review for the UK government on the construction industry there, and they commissioned, the UK government commissioned that study in part because they were dissatisfied with the rate of change that they had experienced, or that had come about from some of the earlier work they'd done about what was required in that. Now, Dean, I know you're familiar with an earlier study, the Egan report, and that in the late 90s, talking about the productivity of the UK's construction industry, and you took some learnings out of that you've applied. Would you like to talk to us about that,
Yeah,
please?
absolutely. So for those of you who are a construction nerd like I, you might have heard of the Egan report published by the UK government in the mid or late 90s, which was a study into what is the largest industry in most developed countries, which is of course the construction industry. And we love to, I suppose, get excited about how much of a contributor we are to the economy. The Egan report, I suppose, had an argument that was slightly different, which said that the construction industry is hugely inefficient and probably holding back the economy and what's possible, with construction sites running at 30 to 40, maybe 50% efficiency at best, and likening it to what was achieved in the automotive space, so particularly in the 50s and 60s, where sort of accuracy is measured to a parts per million basis. So it really drilled in and identified some key or some fundamental flaws in our industry, the siloed nature of the value or the production supply chain, I should say, where the disconnect between a customer's requirements, the design process, procurement, delivery, and then I suppose the ongoing maintenance of any asset is hugely siloed typically, and adds a lot of complexity and inefficiency into the process. I think the troubling thing is that the Farmer report you referred to, published almost 20 years later, basically talks about the same things. So one of the notable absences I sort of pulled out of the Egan report 20 odd years ago was there was no real mention of technology and what role technology may play in our industry, and potentially that's sort of what the conversation today is about. In part, is this an opportunity to really start to take some of the guesswork out of what we do on a daily basis?
Thanks, Dean. I think that reminds us of one of the certainties about construction, or in the past anyway, is that it's not an industry that's renowned for innovation and change. In fact, in many ways, it's been kind of a sanctuary for quite outdated processes and approaches that wouldn't have been tolerated or wouldn't have been left without some major disruptors hitting them in a lot of other industries. If we think about the transformations happening in just about everything else, construction has lagged significantly, and now there's a big call around the world for that to be picked up in a rapid state. And that's not impossible. In fact, we're seeing some quite dramatic step forward with some of the players in Australia, some of the technologies and some of the most advanced prefab, high-rise things that Hickory's doing, like the project that was mentioned earlier today in Melbourne, 43 stories of prefabricated structures that went in that building. That's the US is talking about. They have the tallest prefabricated building in the world at 33 levels. Now, the Hickory guys are a little bit shy about some of this stuff, but they are really on or ahead of the world. And it just shows that with, albeit a great deal of effort, that some of these catch-up exercises that Australia has undertaken and can undertake, if it harnesses the capabilities we have here, can really be quite spectacular. And one of the reasons why we have that is we have quite a small market. So we have the issue about silos in expertise in some of the professions, but in terms of dealing with the market, many of our players can't just be doing one thing. They don't have the stability of the market or the scale of the market, so they're accustomed to flicking around different things and applying different. So in a way, we've got some of that flexibility that I think we're going to need to tackle some of these places. But with that general comment, George, given that we haven't had a culture of innovation and change in Australia or many other countries in the construction industry, can we be confident that we're now going to take this on at the kind of rate that we're hopeful of?
So that was actually a big debate during our consultation on those scenarios. So we ran 4 workshops around Queensland to come up with those scenarios. About 80 people participated. And there was a lot of pessimism, actually, about our innovation culture. And so, there was I suppose, we wanted to challenge them and say, well, why couldn't it change? And at the time, there was a lot of talk about, the future, and there was, Advanced Queensland was kind of coming online at the time, and NISA, the National Innovation Science Agenda. So we're trying to counter it basically with, this idea that maybe some new policy settings would actually trip the industry and among other industries into a different space. But it was I think it was a really tough conversation, and for us to make that an axis where there's uncertainty, where we could be either bold or cautious, that was actually hard work. But when we presented those draft scenarios to CSQ and some of their stakeholders, there's a lot of enthusiasm, and there's been a lot of great uptake of the report. So I think I can't really comment either way, like which way we're going to go. I think our starting point is quite low, but maybe we've hit rock bottom, and maybe there's we can only go up. So.
I'm wondering if the answer might be twofold. It might be a question of the conversion of existing players and what penetration that might have versus an influx of new players who are more open to and actually looking for the more innovative, changed approaches, who are perhaps not too enamoured by the old way of doing things, who are open to that. And that kind of leads on to a question for Caitlin about, with these new technologies, they require new skills and new skill sets in quantity as well as the nature of them. Where are we at for say, the 5D stuff now? Do we have enough of those people? Are we creating enough? Is it individual endeavours of particular players who are doing that? How's that coming about, and where are we on that path of building that capability?
Sure. At the moment, it's still early days, and I think to answer the question before that, there's always going to be the early adopters that everyone pushes out in front and goes, you try it first, and if it works, we'll follow. So there's always going to be a few of that, and people aren't really going to adopt it in the masses until it's trusted. And that's the journey that I guess we have to come along for. That's why BIM is a term that's over 15 years old, and yet some people still don't know what the acronym represents in all reality. In terms of specifically at 5D level, definitely there's some individuals and some companies that are doing it really, really well, but the masses haven't jumped onto it yet. And I think that's more about communicating that it's there, it's trusted, it's reality. Buildings are getting built off of this. Buildings are getting printed off of these things, so it can be trusted. And it's just having that conversation about opening it up and saying, this is here, it's not something in the future, it's something that's now. So it's all a mixed bag. We're very fortunate, I think Matt mentioned it in his presentation, we're very fortunate in Australia and particularly in southeast Queensland that there's a lot of motivated individuals or individual companies that have just gone out and done it because they grasp the idea or they think that idea is really, really cool. And they're the early adapters as well, or adopters I should say. So that's in the design space as well, and lots of contractors are starting to come on board with that as well. So we're starting to see a lot of people using those models for quantities and 5D takeoff.
Dean, we spoke beforehand quickly about your Kmart case study. Would you like to run us through the pod system used there and
Yep.
what kind of outcomes you achieved with it?
Yep. Yeah, so I mentioned at the start that our business is a very much a product of a customer, I suppose a custom problem and a customer who was prepared to think a bit outside of the box to solve the problem, which is why I think I do have confidence that the industry will move forwards, because inevitably we all want things more for less, and in that that forces us to look abroad. And in our example, our company Prime Build, we do a lot of retail refurbishment work across Australia. We were engaged quite early on Kmart, which is a retailer which no doubt we all buy our socks and undies and cheap gifts for friends or whatever from. They sort of embarked on a journey of contracting in a different way, and not that it's overly unique, but it was done, I suppose, in earnest, and it involved engaging, it's a regional framework sort of model whereby a group of consultants, customer representatives and contractors ultimately are assigned basically a 2 to 3 year contract worth of work to basically do the same project over and over again, which was refurbishing retail stores. But ultimately by attacking the same problem many times, the learnings that we gather, every time we do something we learn something inevitably as humans, but by being able to repeat the same process over and over again, those learnings then compounded into cost savings and time savings. And to quantify that, over a 3 year period, we literally took a standard refurbishment of a 5,000 square metre store from a sort of a 10 to 12 week process to a 6 week process, and we took a good 30% off the price, so sort of from $5 to just over $3 million per project, which I'm sure to the shareholders of Wesfarmers, they were pretty happy with that. To the shoppers, to the customers of the Kmart store, they were pretty happy with that because they got their new store sooner. And to us as a contractor or as a part of the process who are willing to adapt and be open to a different way of working, it established our business. So it's sort of, I think there can be a win-win-win. It takes a culture, it takes trust. We've talked about that word a few times, which is largely absent at times in our industry. It also takes a collaborative approach where, as a contractor, you relate to this, the way we engage with our supply chain for them to trust us to come on the journey and not think they're going to get the cane whacked over the hand and have those last couple % of margin screwed from the table, which is unfortunately often the case.
Chris, are you seeing a different kind of take-up or different appetites in different states around Australia about moving down this path to different ways of doing things or challenging the old ways of doing things, or is it pretty much the same across the board?
Oh, no, they're pretty different, yeah, for sure. Each state has a very different view on where things are for them now, as well as where the future goes. With BIM, I mean, the application in some areas is just almost non-existent. Other areas are really jumping onto it, for sure. Yeah. That's true of even building technology and practices right now are so varied across the states, it's incredible. The way that people actually approach the same problem, and it's almost, it's diabolical actually, to be honest, to see some of the ways that things are undertaken in some areas and others in a completely different way.
George, are there particular examples from overseas that you've identified through your research works that you might recall now and give us some thought-provoking...
Yeah, look, I mean, I think just in that sort of innovation zone space, there's a lot of talk in that space around urban living labs in Europe, and some of that stuff is quite small scale, but it's it's proliferating. There's literally hundreds of them, and they're all networked. They have an association. It's something that we want to replicate in Australia, but I think in terms of increasing the appetite for risk and pushing new frontiers, it's hard to go past the eco-city movement and smart city movement that we're seeing in Asia. And some of that stuff is kind of aspirational, and it looks a little bit empty on the ground. But even if it's 10%, if 10% comes off, I mean, it's pretty impressive. We're talking about hundreds of new cities, India, China, and they all want to have jobs of the future. They want, China wants to be, the biggest, I think it is the biggest exporter of industrial robots. But they want to be an AI hub, and they want to see all the new jobs that come from that technology in their country, in their cities.
Caitlin, one of the advantages you touched on about the 5D model is reduced effort and particularly reduced repeated effort. Is that something you'd like to expand on for us, please?
Sure, yeah. What were the statistics you were using? Our construction industry is 40% efficient.
At best.
At best.
It's a well-run site.
There's definitely a lot to be desired there and massive opportunity. And I think that's something that we can achieve through BIM and through 3D models is the fact that in the past, if you start at design and an architect is designing a building, they pass that over to structural engineers. By the time it gets to the contractor, they need to start learning the building from the ground up. So there's wasted effort in just understanding the building as opposed to the design team that have known it for months and they know it in intimate detail. So there's wasted effort there in a traditional sense. Once the contractor's finished with the building, then they hand it over to the owner, who then has to understand their building. There's things hidden above ceilings or there's things hidden in the roof. So there's wasted effort there in a traditional sense in terms of understanding their own building. I think the opportunity that we have through 3D models is smoothing that out and getting a bit more efficiency in terms of visually and virtually. Once you see a model on the screen that's your building, and we know that a lot of people have trouble understanding 2D documentation and visualizing that, if we can put that on the screen in a 3D sense, you can start to explore it through your computer. It's a real big opportunity to reduce that wasted effort, just in that sense of visualization of the building. When we bring it through to owner-operator and handing over the building at the end, it's things like understanding how to maintain a building, and that's where the biggest costs are in buildings. So understanding that a building that's replicated where we sit and also in the computer, and understanding that they know when to maintain the plan of the AC or when to replace it without having to go and check on it. It's something in the computer that's already triggered. It's already a link to the manufacturer. I think there's big opportunities there that we still need to embrace in the future. But it all starts with that point of just embracing the 3D technology to start with.
There's a huge opportunity for improving compliance with it as well. The reality is the upfront specification of parts, and that goes, whether it be passive fire systems or the type of pipe or whatever the case may be, it's so much more accessible. People aren't trying to make decisions on site, and therefore you get your non-conforming building products, which is about to be legislated. It's going to move into the future where we're just saying, how can we be sure that we're building the right thing? How can we be sure that we're selecting the right product? As suppliers come on board with all of that as well and feed back into that BIM system, it's going to make huge changes with cost and efficiency without a doubt, and minimisation of waste. Yes. The waste that's produced in construction is ridiculous. We've got 10-star, we've got guys that are claiming to be 10-star now rather than 6-star, and they're producing houses that have 3 garbage bags of rubbish. That's it. And they intend to have that down to 0 by 2020, and all of their houses carbon positive by 2020. That's just around the corner. And here we are talking about, you've got a massive skip out the front of some houses, and other houses are being built that produce 3 garbage bags of rubbish at the moment, intend to be 0 within 3 years, and they're carbon positive. It's a big difference. And that's what I was talking about when we talk about the different areas and whatnot. We're just seeing such diversity in how people are taking up the technology that's available. But as technology grows and the integration of all of those parts, we're talking about drones, smartphones, all those things that start to integrate into it. And one of the earlier talks was about the 20 billion cameras on the road by within 10 years or whatever. All those things start feeding into it. BIM is a part of it. You go up to the QC lab where they've got the real view system, and they can go into just about any place on Earth and actually walk into. You can actually go land on Google Earth, go into the building, and then start walking through the building, and it's generating a 3D image of it as you're walking through, as if you're actually there. And it's using all of the data that's captured through BIM and whatnot. Only some buildings, because there's not that many with BIM in real terms. But I mean, if you look at 20 buildings, you can walk in and check everything out to the point where you can open an access panel virtually and look at a valve and see what sort of what the make and model is, and it brings up a little diagram of where you get it from, when it needs to be maintained next, all that information. As that feeds into it, it'll change the way that certainly the way clients expect buildings to be delivered.
And just to add to that, maybe something that Australia can do really well is Regtech. So actually coding regulations and making it talk to BIM models I mean, something we know how to do really well is regulate. So maybe this can be a new frontier for the local industry.
The USA have got like a code assist. So it's a bit like your Google Assistant. They've got code assistants now where you can actually ask a question, what is the specification for this, or what's the code requirement for this? And it goes through basically through AI and determines which part of the code you should be looking at. Because people have got no idea. There's thousands of codes and pages and all the things that they need to work out. What do I need to do in this particular case here? And now they're getting an assistant where they can almost ask an automated assessment, which replaces the certifier in some respects. And that's happening now. So we're talking 20 years' time. People will be able to walk around. They'll have eyepieces on and be able to record what they're doing, and it'll be analysing it back to all the codes and whatnot. And it should actually be able to tell you you're looking at something and this is wrong. You should be able to alert this is something's wrong here, and you start looking at it, start working through it. If people are still on sites, but assuming they are for a minute, they'll have a lot better technology to help them with the job. Just as 10 years ago we didn't have smartphones or tablets to assist with defects recording or whatever the case may be, and that's a small application. But as you move into 10, 20 years' time, those things we'll be doing a lot more. You have GPS on drills and whatnot nowadays, where you can actually, the drill tells you where to drill, so that you don't have to worry about hitting anything that's in the wall, which is recorded in your BIM. They can say there's a pipe there, move over to the left 6 millimetres and then drill, and the light comes on and shows you where to drill a hole. Removes a lot of human error from it all.
So we're not far away from being able to ask Siri if it's code compliant.
That's it, yeah.
This closely related to my next point about non-conforming products. It's obviously a very hot topic in the country at the moment. We've got Senate inquiries, we've got issues with asbestos being found in children's hospitals, even today with the kind of expectations and protocols around that. So it's a hot topic for us. And traceability, as well as certification at the start and the veracity of the supply chains, but traceability is another dimension to first helping ensure that we're getting what we think we're getting, but second, once something's been identified as a failure or a non-compliant product, having a mechanism to trace where else we might find that. Whether we're somebody who's doing projects, repeated projects, and the material's coming from a certain supplier, and then there's found to be an issue with that, or we're a bathroom pod manufacturer and we've got a part that's starting to fail, we don't really want to wait till everyone successively fails on every project we've done. We want to be able to flag that at the start, and then say, where else have we used that part, and be able to quickly identify that, and then go back and do the remedial actions in an orderly fashion that the client's going to be happy with, rather than track them down the back. So some of these sensor technologies, some of the veracity of the supply chain, the construction industry is now being increasingly asked to apply those kind of standards and traceability and accountability that perhaps we haven't been asked about as much as, and certainly not as much as some of the players in sports shoe manufacturers or clothing industries are expected to know, not just where they bought that thing from, but what the conditions are back up the chain, where the materials are made, where the factories are there, what are the human rights issues involved with those things, what are the working conditions. Now, they're not questions that have been traditionally asked of the construction industry, and they're not questions that the answers are going to be readily available at the moment, but I'm thinking that some of the digital technologies and some of these new systems that we're talking about are going to give us some kind of improved ability to start working down that path. Do the panellists have some comments along those lines?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we're moving to a point where BIM is the hub. It is the hub of all of that information, and it feeds back into all of the technologies that can support it, whether it be on-site inspections or whether it be from the suppliers themselves. The impact that high net worth companies, your manufacturing type, as they move away from cars or whatever the case may be, as they start to go, geez, we need to get into something, they'll take a lot of that on board. game changed the way that, that things are delivered. You got a lot of significant companies. Mitsubishi create all of the air conditioning units, and they create all of the Apollic and whatnot that we use on the outside of buildings, the ACP. You'll see that they're quite a large company. They're fairly advanced in that sort of field. You'll see the smaller operators that are just copying it and sending it out of China. You'll get the legislation across the board through the countries which will be saying, no, you need to be doing at least this, which will put it back onto a level playing field, and people start to invest in that and take over and work out better ways of delivering the same product, and then it'll just tie into the entire process. And being able to order it and say, this is what we require through our BIM models, so we require 10,000 square metres of this particular panel, whatever the case may be, you'll be able to actually vet it, place the order through the system, and it'll be verified on site. You better go onto site. You might have some sort of hand scanning device or Google Glass or whatever the case may be, and it should be able to pick up a data dot or some sort of marking device on those products and verify it right then. The point where certification of the end product of the building may be very, very easily. It may just be you literally walk around and look at it, and the recording of what you're seeing is being analysed back against the plans, back against the BIM. It's picking up all the bits, picking up the data dots, and identifying that the correct product has been used. And it should be able to bring up an alert saying this hasn't been inspected. You need to go and look at this so that it can verify it back there. It'll almost remove the human part of it, other than just to simply be there. And that may even turn into B-sized drones or whatever in the future in any case, but certainly in the foreseeable future, there's going to be an ability to have technology which takes the guesswork out of it. But,
And that's not in the
but you need that bin as the central hub, without a doubt.
I was going to say, that's not in the future, that's happening now. There's RFID tagging that they're putting on reinforcement so they know where every bar of Rio is in a building. There's sensors or sacrificial sensors that you can put in concrete so you can understand when it hits its required strength, which is more accurate than the samples that you send off. So there's things that are happening right now that's already doing that. It's about taking it a step further, and how far can we push it on every piece of the building to represent that as well.
Dean, what are some of the things that you think those of us in the room today might do to help themselves to become part of this, or better adapt to the kind of changes that are underway?
Yep. For those of us who are left standing, from our end, as I mentioned, I think as a customer or as a contributor to the overall process, it is about recognising what impacts are we making on those around us. Again, we can sort of, whether we're in the design phase or the delivery phase, if we're totally focused on what suits us and how we're going to make sure we deliver for the best possible margin for our slice of the pie, potentially that has a knock-on effect, which ultimately, I think that the ultimate loser is always the end user or the customer. Sure, as a builder, we might take a knock on a margin, but that puts, again, compounds the pressure, and ultimately the final product, whether it's through maintenance costs, whether it's through delays in the process, gets impacted. So potentially thinking how we can procure material or procure contracting services more efficiently, and then for us on the contracting side, thinking about how we can be more efficient in how we procure things. An example I'll use, if everyone looks to the left and looks at those egress signs, the green signs on the wall, so as an example of the inefficiency of the supply chain, if I go down to the local electrical wholesaler, I'll pay $150 to $200 for each of those signs with a battery backup. I can go to Shanghai and buy it for $14 off the shelf. So the inherent cost that comes with our inefficient approach, because we're not modelling projects properly, so we don't know what we need until the last minute. So we run down to the wholesaler, we pay tenfold the actual cost, which means we had to cut some corners on some panel which weren't certified, and then we have an issue with it's just this inherent sort of cycle that happens. So more planning up front is the start of it, I think, anyway.
It may or may not catch fire.
Potentially.
$14. It's $14.
No, sorry, $14, that's for the same one.
Yeah,
that's the identical unit.
Assuming it's the same one, yeah.
So that's the China-made one that you're talking about. You buy it locally for 10 times the price.
It's identical. It comes from the same factory. It's just there's a supply chain that adds tenfold of cost with, I'd argue, little to no extra value.
We're coming close to the end of our time for our panel discussion this afternoon. Are there any other comments that the panel would like to make at this stage?
I mean, I think the take-home message from my talk was, have somebody in your organisation or in your team that obsesses about new products, new tech, something new processes, and is thinking about how to apply it to your business or transform your business. And if you don't have that person, partner with a company that does. And if you can't find a company, find a research institute, do something, basically. The technology, I think what you've got from the panel discussion is that the technology is moving so fast. And the sort of, if you look back and you think about the adoption cycle and the time it took for something new to transform, an industry like smart devices, that time frame is going to compress massively in the future. There's a lot of people that really get tripped up on that, and I think that's my biggest concern, is that people aren't paying attention to the pace of the change, and are not they're not sort of responding accordingly.
Mine would be, a lot of this conference today has been about things that are happening in the future and things that may not be foreseeable right now, and it seems like a cool idea, like the drone that's going to carry, was it 10 to 15 people? And to me that just sounds outrageous, but I'm sure in 5 years' time I'll probably get in one if it showed up at my door. Yeah. So the thing is that these things are achievable and they're happening very, very rapidly, to just embrace it, and there's things that are here right now that's achievable. So things that might seem like too big of a picture, it starts off somewhere. So for the BIM picture, it starts off with a 3D model. Is your design team using a 3D model? Start with that, start the conversation, and see where it can take you. Because the concept is huge, and that may seem scary, but it starts with a small piece of that concept.
The industry has a lot of resistance to change. It needs a lot of strong leadership. It's about encouraging people who are interested in innovation, but also actually doing something about it, embracing it and putting it on your jobs, giving it a go.
Just in closing then, I think one of the things that George has talked about, identifying resource, whether it's internal, whether it's collaboration with research institutions or other people who are also scanning the environment for the kinds of things that they should be picking up on or might like to collaborate in. I think one of the dangers is that complacency is probably not a strategy that you want to be relying on. And I think what we're seeing in the prefab offsite modular space is that the competitors aren't necessarily who you think they might be. And that means you may not be looking in the right places to identify the change and the pace of change that's occurring around. And I think a couple of examples, one's in China with the Broad Group, who you may well have seen on YouTube, where they put together a 50-odd story building in 18 days or 20 days or things. So there was a meticulous planning process, standardised componentry, a bit like a Meccano type building. They also used a hell of a lot of people on site, so it wasn't sort of the nth degree, but it was a particularly dramatic way to depict the way things can be done in the future. What's interesting about that Broad Group is that they're not necessarily at the cutting edge of technology. They're very much in a collaborative state, very much thinking it all out at the start and having the various players in the different teams, the designers, the engineers, and who's going to deliver it and build it in a room, in an old-fashioned kind of way, in a big room, get them all together, bang their heads together, get them sorted out and get on with it. But that approach came from, the guy behind that, the one that made his money, was from air conditioners in China. He made air conditioners, made his fortune in air conditioning, and said, why don't I bring this, look at construction, look at the guys I'm selling this stuff to. We've got a manufacturing mentality, we've got a supply chain mentality, we're thinking about these efficiencies, we live and breathe this stuff all the time. The next step down the chain isn't doing that. Why don't I lend my hand to that? And he turned his hand to that, and he's now taking the forefront on some of this stuff. Right here in Australia, we've got an example of a Impressor House. There's a firm in Melbourne who has bought the latest German automated panel making equipment. So think of flat pack buildings. So an IKEA type flat pack product, engineered to go together with all the cutouts and the pieces, but for houses at the moment. That venture is financed by somebody who made money out of telecoms. But it was then said, here's a way, if we look around, where's an industry that hasn't been disrupted, or to a significant extent? Construction is one of the first ones that come to mind when people scan around for that. And so the potential for disruption, the potential to come in and tackle this a different way, is being looked at by people who we wouldn't even identify with the construction industry. And I think that's a sobering thought for many of us in the industry. It's also a very exciting prospect for those of us who would like to see us move more quickly down that path. So I'll close up now, and please join with me in thanking our panellists this afternoon, and then we'll adjourn next door to the networking drinks, which are kindly sponsored by Hutchinson Builders. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.